Good morning, colleagues. My name is Matthew Billow. I'm a Senior Coordination Officer at UNEP, based in Geneva, Switzerland. Let me extend a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the IBC on Environment and Climate Change. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and joining us for the second webinar in this series, which provides further training on approaches and tools for mainstreaming environment and climate change into the UNSDCFs. The guidance for mainstreaming environment and climate change in the CFs is the product of a fruitful collaboration between the 18 member agencies of the IBC and cooperation with DCO. The guidance was released in June last year, and at the launch event we informed you about the upcoming training on how to use this guidance. The guidance responds to the request by RCs in Europe and Central Asia region, who asked for IBC's support in identifying and mainstreaming key regional environmental and climate change risks, challenges, and opportunities at the country level, notably in country level documents. So we are very pleased to offer you two training events that aim to increase the understanding of the entry points and practical approaches and tools for mainstreaming environment and climate change into the UN SDCF processes. The first training event was held in December last year. It introduced the guidance and provided opportunities on knowledge sharing within and across the three sub-regions on mainstreaming environment and climate change. A wide range of colleagues attended from UNCTs from the majority of UN programme countries in the Pan-European region. A recording of that training is available on the IBC web page, which is currently hosted by UNECE. So if you missed that event, you can go back and listen to it. This virtual training is part of a series of 3 sub-regional level training events to be held this January. This session is focused on the 5 Central Asian states. We will have a very interesting and interactive session today, and we look forward to your active participation. I'd like to thank in advance our colleagues from Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan for joining us today, and they will be sharing their experiences with us in the breakout rooms on specific issues, and we look forward to hearing about those later. I'd also like to thank DCO for their support to this process as well. In a moment, our training facilitators from the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Canada will provide an overview of the virtual workshop and the objectives of the event. Taking this opportunity, I would like to thank our colleagues from IISD and our consultant, Henrietta Martonakova, for developing this training workshop. With this, I would like to invite Livia Bizikova from IISD to provide an overview of the webinar for today. And thank you very much for your attendance. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, so my name is Livia Bizikova, and I'm a lead at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and I am very happy to welcome you all joining this event. And it's a great opportunity to talk about really an important issue of mainstreaming, climate change, and other issues in times when we are concerned about other challenges of COVID and post-COVID, but we are also concerned about issues of climate change impacts and how to plan better. So this workshop that will be facilitating with my colleague has 2 parts, as Matt described. We had the first part in December when Henrietta provided an overview of the guidance material, and we really focused on how to start the mainstreaming process. Where are those effective entry points? And today we will have a more kind of working session when we look at what kind of tools and approaches we can use to actually make the mainstreaming work happen. And then also we will provide space for your inputs around these tools and the experiences that you have with these tools in your countries. So let's just briefly look at the overview of today's agenda. So obviously now we are at the state of welcome and introductions, and we will be then move to start the main body of the workshop, where we will look at the approaches and tools. The core part of the workshops will be a series of presentation by the lead author of the guidance material, Henrietta Martonakova, with some quizzes and places for question and answers from you so that we can discuss some of the approaches and kind of the suggested modes of doing mainstreaming as was described in the guidance document. Then we will have 2 breakout groups. So this is basically where we try to do a deep dive into 2 types of tools. So one will focus on risk assessment and linkages, and the other one focuses more on, once we know the risk and linkages, how we can integrate them into the results framework and how we can create measurement and evaluation types of indicators. So those 2 breakout groups will be then facilitated by IISD. And after that, we will come back together for a brief question and answer session and kind of catch up. So now I would like to introduce my co-facilitator, Darren Swanson, who is a long-term colleague at IISD. Darren is now a senior associate with IISD, and he was involved in many projects related to mainstreaming. On some we work together, also projects related to SDGs and SDG assessment for many different UN agencies, and also guidebook designs and evaluation methods. So Darren, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Livia, and welcome everybody. I just want to highlight that this is a very interactive type format that we're going to have today for this webinar. Very similar to the first webinar that we had in December. We're going to have a series of polls and knowledge quiz questions that we'll be administering throughout the session, and we're going to have some Q&A sessions, of course, where you can pose questions to your colleagues and presenters. So we encourage you to use the chat space or the raise hand function. We're going to have, as Livia mentioned, we're going to have a number of 2 breakout rooms where we're going to be talking about different topics, and we're going to have some plenary discussions. So lots of interaction, and so fasten your seatbelts, and we're going to get started here. So just as a bit of a recap of the first webinar that we had back in December, that was a high-level session where we talked about the entry points for mainstreaming environment and climate change into cooperation frameworks. And we had a presentation from Henrietta, the lead author of the guidance documents, went over the high-level parts of the guidance, and we had 3 breakout rooms, 3 sub-regional breakout rooms for those of you that were there and those that weren't. We had Central Asia room, we had Eastern Europe and the Caucasus room, and we had the Southeastern Europe and Turkey room. And in those rooms, we talked about and shared experiences on mainstreaming environment and climate change into cooperation frameworks. And we were glad to have with us in those sessions. We had featured speakers from Kazakhstan, from Georgia, and from North Macedonia. And that allowed us to have a good sort of plenary discussion after the breakout rooms about experiences, challenges, and enabling factors for mainstreaming. So it was a very rich discussion. So as a bit of a recap, let's go now to the first poll on the screen. And this is just a question to help refresh your memories from the first webinar. So the first question as a recap is, which of the following are the entry points for mainstreaming environment and climate change into cooperation frameworks? And you can select all that apply. So this tests your memory from the first webinar. All right, let's take a peek. Let's take a peek at the results. Yes, indeed. So a lot of people were selecting across the board, and indeed all of the answers apply. So when Henrietta gave the presentation in the first webinar, of course, we had the roadmap, entry points in the common country analysis, entry points in the design phase of a cooperation framework, implementation, and right through monitoring and evaluation. So lots of places where mainstreaming can occur and benefit, and that's what the first webinar was all about. All right, so here's a bonus question. For those of you from the first webinar that have a photographic memory and can recall the word cloud, where we talked about challenges that you have experienced in mainstreaming environment and climate change into cooperation frameworks. Which of the 3 on this list do you think were the most mentioned in that first webinar by participants? Which of the three do you think were the most mentioned? Let's take a look. So what we did here in the first webinar in terms of challenges that people were experiencing in mainstreaming, of course, limited capacity was the one that appeared the most and was most talked about. It takes a lot to have these cross-team discussions that can identify the issues and look at the linkages, risks, and all the various aspects of mainstreaming. So capacity was a big issue. Political will was another one that was mentioned, of the three, the most mentioned. And also the need for more guidance for how to do and where are the entry points. That was another one of the three most mentioned areas. And of course, the other ones were mentioned as well. So you're not wrong in answering that. But participants stressing that they were looking for more guidance. Now that's what this training was all about in December. And that's what this one is all about, is to provide more guidance for the various ways to mainstream. And this is now going to get, I guess, more under the hood, so to speak, of details of approaches and tools for mainstreaming. So without further ado, we do want to get into the details right now. And we have Henrietta Martinikova, who is the lead author of the guidance document that prepared on mainstreaming. And Henrietta is an environmental governance and impact assessment specialist based in the Slovak Republic. She has experience in strategic environmental assessment, poverty, environment nexus, analyzing gender, environment, and energy linkages, and also working with measures on greening post-COVID-19 recovery in the ECA region. Henrietta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Darren. Greetings to everybody from Bratislava, Slovakia. So as Darren has already mentioned, I will be presenting examples of approaches and tools to be applied when mainstreaming environment and climate change to different stages of developing the country cooperation framework, including the roadmap, country analysis, and cooperation framework design document. This will be the key stages which I would be focused on. I would briefly also touch upon the implementation stage and monitoring and evaluation stage, which will be in more detail discussed during the second breakout room. Both in the guidance and now during the presentation, I would like to stress I am presenting only a few examples of approaches and methods for mainstreaming, because there is a large number of methods and tools that could be used, and the guidance itself doesn't in detail show all the possible or large number of possible methods and tools for mainstreaming. But nevertheless, whatever methods and tools and approaches are selected, they are determined by several factors, which is the programming process. As I have mentioned, maybe those who attended the first seminar, I have mentioned that according to the cooperation framework guidance and guidance in the compendium package mentions that the time for developing the cooperation framework, including the CCA and cooperation framework document, is relatively short, from 6 to 9 months. So it means that that design of those documents is not expecting UN country teams to use the primary data, but rather to use existing data and information from existing studies and from experts. And the same would come for the mainstreaming. Also, the selection of methods is specified by the character, scope, and data of the programming document. So, for example, the level of data used in the CCA or cooperation framework document and level of data used in a specific project related, for example, to infrastructure would be different. So also this reflects the selection of the appropriate methods and tools. So basically, we can say that in this process, we should try to use the simplest possible methods which are time and cost effective, not to make the overall design of the CCA and cooperation framework document overcomplicated and costly. And of course, the compendium package which guides the process of CCA and cooperation framework document design itself contains a number of methods. So many times it is just enough to use the proposed method and extend only by adding additional data related to environment and climate change. Okay, so let's start to have a look how we could proceed with mainstreaming into the roadmap, where the key mainstreaming steps would be to engage key actors, make the case or advocate for mainstreaming environment and climate change, and ensure that the budget for mainstreaming is available if an extra budget is needed. Here is an example of how to engage, what method or tool to use for engaging stakeholders. This seems to be seemingly seems to be a seemingly step that sometimes would seem to be less important, but in terms of mainstreaming, it is extremely important because you want to bring around the table people with different expertise. And in terms of mainstreaming environment and climate change, you want to make sure that you have stakeholders which both can advocate and push for a mainstreaming agenda, and also the people who have expertise and knowledge. The table shows the example of how you could do the stakeholders analysis or also stakeholders mapping. So you identify which are the right stakeholders for each stage of the UN programming process. You identify role or level of the involvement and also mechanisms and tools for involving them. It is important also at the roadmap stage to advocate and make the case for environment and climate change mainstreaming, especially among the so-called non-environmental stakeholders and actors in the process. It is important to bring in this stage, it is important to bring a very clear and simple messages, which are however based on the reliable studies and data. So you can use infographics or policy briefs and present, and other tools, of course, and present them during the presentations or formal or informal discussions, for example. As it comes to entry point, designing common country analysis, just the recap of some of the key mainstreaming steps. It is extremely important to analyze the linkages between environment and climate change and other development areas. This is, I think, the key for the whole process. For the key aspects, identify environment and climate change priorities and commitments, assess progress towards SDGs, and identify and evaluate the risks related to climate change and environment. Let's have a look at examples of some tools. As I have said, identifying the linkages is key to the whole process of CCA, but also cooperation framework design document. This slide presents an example of very simple metrics of synergies, where in the columns you have priority environmental and climate change issues for the country, and in the rows you have priority or key development areas or sectors or objectives in those areas and sectors. So, for example, in the column you have air pollution, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, or greenhouse gas emissions, while you can have as a development priorities: transport improvement, country energy independence, agriculture, improved strategic planning, and so on. In this simple metrics, by 0, you show that there is actually no very strong link between those issues. And by number 1, you identify that there is a strong link between those issues. Of course, there are different types of matrices, but you can go into more details. For example, there are impact matrices where you can by using the minus sign, you can say that the impact will be negative. By plus sign, the impact will be positive. But I think Darren will be talking more about those type of matrices in the breakout room 1. Besides identifying the key linkages, this exercise is also important for UN country team to actually help them to focus on the key issues in the whole process, so they don't waste time and capacity on other issues that are not that relevant. For the issues that has shown the strong linkages, so for the key issues, environment and climate change issues, it is important that your country team identifies what are the country priorities and commitments in those issues. So here again, we have a very simple table which shows the way how you can document or clearly pass the message what are those priorities. So for example, the country has identified the climate change mitigation is one of the priorities. So you try to list and ideally quantify the commitments for this objective. You find those official commitments either in the national development strategies, in the sectoral strategies, or in the environment climate change specific strategies, or in the commitments to multilateral environmental agreements. In the CCA devotes, there is one section in CCA where UN country teams are supposed to assess progress towards SDGs. Here, in terms of mainstreaming, it is important that you assess the progress towards SDGs, which are specifically related to climate change and environment, which is 13, 14, and 15. Of course, those that are relevant for the country. But again, in terms of mainstreaming, it is also important if you have specific, if the country had specific targets and if it has data, to also assess progress towards the environment and climate change related targets that support achievement of the non-environmental SDGs. The table which I show, it's the extraction from the North Macedonia CCA, which actually identified environment and climate change progress towards environment and climate change related targets of 13 out of 17 SDGs. So it is, I think it was a very good progress assessment. Just an example, in terms of SDG 3 related to health, they identify the number of deaths annually related to air pollution. Let's look at the less obvious linkages in SDG 16, which is related to good governance. They stress the importance of Aarhus Convention, which supports free access to information, environmental information, public participation in environmental matters, and environmental justice. Yeah, another very important part in the CCA is where your country teams conduct so-called multi-dimensional risk assessment. In terms of mainstreaming, the country team should provide an overview of the environment and climate change risks, its significance, likelihood and impact, and also, if possible, early warning indicators that would be monitored over the time to inform necessary changes in the countries and the UN development system responses. This is again, the table again shows the example from North Macedonia CCA, where on one hand, the country shows what risk could be posed by environment and especially climate change in terms of extreme weather conditions and what could be impact to human health and economic development. But also, on the other hand, they show what could be the risk of inadequate infrastructure and access to services in terms of drinking water supply and drinking water quality, or quality of the water in rivers and other surface waters and groundwaters. This is just an example from the UNDP social and environmental screening procedure, which provide a guidance for the so-called rapid assessment of the significance of the risks, where they help you to rate the impact scale of the risk and also the likelihood of the risk. So in terms of impact, they move from the critical risk, which is high in magnitude and space. It can affect large number of people. It can have transboundary impacts. It can be long-term or even permanent and reversible, and so on. And these are the type of risk that you would probably like to avoid. It moves to the moderate risks, which could be avoided, managed, or mitigated with relatively uncomplicated accepted measures, or to negligible risks, which you do not have to deal with. In terms of likelihood, you can rate the risk from expected to moderate likely and to the slight occurrence of risk. Yes, I think here I finished the first part of my presentation.
Yes, you did. And thank you for the presentation, and thank you for the walkthrough of how to move from the idea of mainstreaming to actually starting to do the process of mainstreaming and using some of the tools that also the risk assessment tools will be then discussed further with one of our working groups. So, but let's now just do a quick 2 quiz questions to pick up on 2 important issues that Henrietta just talked about. So let's use our phones or go online. And so the first question is about, so when we are preparing the cooperation framework of country roadmap, so what we are using to engage the key stakeholders or the key actors. We are using a stakeholder analysis, we are using a matrix of synergies or risk assessment. You remember maybe that Henrietta showed us the table where we can identify actors, can identify their engagement with different departments and also their role in the mainstreaming process. So now we are trying to figure out how that thing is called. So let's see, any more voting? Okay, so this was easy, but yes, so that was the stakeholder analysis that would be make the first in the early stages of the mainstreaming process to get the insights from different experts. So now let's see the second question. Yes. So when we are conducting the common country analysis, what kind of tool we are using to estimate the linkages between the environmental climate issue and the national development priorities? So what kind of tool, and Henrietta talked about that when we would like to think about the infrastructure or access to drinking water, other challenges, and we would like to look at the climate change or environmental impacts, what tools we can use. So we already discussed the stakeholder analysis, but we can also use that one, or matrix of synergies or risk assessment. But let's see the answers for how we analyze the linkages between environment, climate, and national development priorities. Yes, we use the matrix of synergies. Yeah, the risk assessment, that also could be relevant. I like risk assessment. So let's move to the next slide, and we have a space for you to ask questions, and then we will move to the next set of slides by Henrietta. So you can feel free to raise your hand and ask the questions, or if you prefer, you can also type it into the chat box and we will read it. So let's see if there are any questions. Maybe I can ask something, I make some notes. So one question maybe what I can ask Henrietta would be about when you mentioned that sometimes when we look at the national documents on climate change and other things, MEAs, it would be good to quantify the relationship between how the country roadmap and the efforts would influence these country commitments. Now, so I'm wondering how much we really need to quantify it and how much is enough to have a narrative or an understanding of what the linkage is. Because sometimes quantifying can be quite hard, but maybe in your experience, we should strive for quantification.
Maybe I was not clear in the presentation. I more meant, well, I will explain. When I did the gap analysis of the CCAs, of the 13 CCAs, in the section where the countries should list their national priorities, at first I have had a look whether they list national priorities related to environment and climate change at all. And many did, but usually they just listed the commitments, for example, to regional or international conventions, but they didn't actually say what the commitments are. So my point was to say that it's not sufficient just to list to which conventions we have commitments, but in terms of later in the when we design the cooperation framework document, it would be good to know exactly what the commitments are, so you can refer to that when linking the development results priorities or development areas priorities with priorities in the environment and climate change, or with the objectives. Mm-hmm. So I was not talking about quantifying the linkages because it can be difficult. Yeah.
Okay. Any question? Any more question?
There is something in the chat, I think. But...
yeah, my chat is empty, to be honest, but maybe there's something wrong with my chat.
Okay, no, it's no. Okay, fine.
And maybe my other question, which and then we can move on to the next, that would be, you mentioned, that we are quantifying the potential impact of climate change or environmental challenges on the planned priorities or activities, that if you plan to, let's say, build a large infrastructure, you need to think of climate change extremes or, water availability impacts if you want to build a hydroelectric plant. But that also, and then you kind of mentioned later that we also need to think about other way around. So the impact of the development or the planet activities on climate change or the environment as well. So it's kind of a both-way relationship.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that maybe a little bit?
Well, when we talk about quantifying the impact of climate change on infrastructure, that would, I think, come more when we mainstream at the project level. Of course, in some CCAs, countries where they obviously conducted such kind of studies. They provided quantification or assessment of economic losses due to, for example, natural disasters related to climate change. I think that would be also possible vice versa. For example, if the country's objective was to improve energy efficiency, but then it would again depend whether they would mean generally or for certain sectors, then maybe it could be quantified in terms of hopefully decrease of the greenhouse gas emissions. But that would happen ideally.
Yeah.
That would be also maybe one of the targets and indicators, but the data would be needed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was kind of thinking, yeah, the same from the contribution point of view. So I'm not sure. So last chance, and if there are no more questions, then we can move to the next set of slides, and then after the slides, we will have the breakout groups.
Okay, thank you, Livia. So we are moving to another very important stage of UN programming, which is designing of the cooperation framework document, which should be very much linked to the analysis done in the common country analysis. The key steps in terms of mainstreaming, to recap from the first webinar, are to actually confirm those key environment and climate change risks and opportunities which would be ideally identified in CCA. Integrate them into the cooperation framework strategic priorities and theory of change, and then consequently reflect them in the cooperation framework document results framework, where we identify outcomes, output indicators, and targets. I am moving directly to integrating environment and climate change into results framework. Before doing so, as it comes to integrating to theory of change and strategic priorities, maybe the metrics of synergies or could be also used, the one that I presented, or similar one that I presented at the CCA stage, where you actually would look for the linkages between environment and climate change objectives identified in CCA and priorities and objectives in the country priority development sectors or areas. Then you would move to reflection of those linkages in the results framework, where approach you could divide into two stages. At first, you would analyze how your proposed development results, by development results, using the language of the cooperation framework guidance, mean outputs or outcomes, would affect the achievement of the environment and climate change objectives and commitments which you pre-identified in the CCA and confirmed here. Or on the other hand, how may actions towards achieving those environment and climate change objectives and priorities would contribute to a better development results, or on the other hand, how inaction would compromise the achievement of the development results. Let's see the example of such impact assessment, where in the very top row you have a selected environmental and climate change priority that you identified, which for country X could be integrate climate change adaptation aspect into relevant sectors development policies, plans, and programs. And you would like to assess what would be mutual relations or effects with one of your pre-identified outcomes and output, which is related to good or improved government. So your outcome is improved government. you could expect that if you improve governance in terms of participatory policy making, in terms of transparency, you would create a good enabling environment for integrating climate change adaptation in the policies and plans. So you expect the positive effects, but you should also count with certain constraints, which would be low political will to mainstream climate change or insufficient capacity. And you translate those concerns into possible implementing interventions. Like, for example, advocate for mainstreaming or build capacity for mainstreaming through guidelines and training. Once you assess that there is impact, in this case, the impact would be positive. If you improve, as I said, if you improve governance, there is a better chance that you mainstream more effectively climate change adaptation into the country development planning. Then you should make sure that your development results are formulated in such a way that actually they support such development. So basically, you apprise your results framework. You do it by combination of two ways. You set the development results, outcomes or outputs, focusing specifically on addressing environment and climate change, which actually is the case in all of the cooperation framework documents. But besides of that, you make sure that also your non-environmental, so-called non-environmental outcomes and outputs are cross-referencing and aligned with environmental and climate change priorities and commitments for the countries. Let's read just one example. Country X has originally identified output 1 under the good governance outcome as inclusive national and local governance systems have greater resilience and capacities to mainstream gender, migration, and ensure evidence-based and participatory policymaking, map and address inequalities, and deliver quality services to all. This is taken from the Georgia country framework. If you want to stress that environment and climate change should not be neglected in this process, you just basically add these words into the formulation of the outcome. It is important that you also identify the relevant indicators, of course, taking into account the data availability. For example, one of the indicators could be legislation in support of environment and climate change mainstreaming is in place or is enforced. This seems just like a kind of playing with words exercise, but if you want to make sure that that in implementation of your cooperation framework through programs and projects, environment and climate change is effectively taken into account, I think it's important to provide this frame and direction at this stage of the UN programming. I will not spend much time on the stage of implementation because country cooperation frameworks are mainly implemented through programs and projects, and they usually, or some agencies have already designed and applied their own systems for mainstreaming. So whatever systems are or whatever approaches agencies use to integrate into the programs and projects, I think there are 3 key steps that should be taken in such a mainstreaming process. At first, the project or program should be screened in terms of environment, climate change, whether there is actually a need at all to address environment and climate change. Then if there is a need to address environment and climate change, to assess impact on environment and climate change or vice versa, and that the impact is relevant, to suggest how the environment and climate change risks and impacts and also opportunities would be managed and implemented. Cooperation framework monitoring and evaluation. As I have mentioned, Olivia would talk and discuss with you more about this in the breakout room 2 of this session. I would just emphasize that there are 2 key dimensions of this process. In the evaluation, you assess progress and achievement of outputs, outcomes, and targets related to environment and climate change, both for non-environment, both related to environment and climate change specific outcomes and outputs and non-environmental, but also you assess the mainstreaming process and system set by UN country team that would be ideally set up to enable mainstreaming in the implementation stage. So basically, briefly and in a simplified matter set, the approach would be formulation application of SDG-based outcomes, outputs, indicators, and targets, including for non-environmental priorities. Formulation application of criteria to assess the mainstreaming system. It is important to integrate into monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan. And it is important that that those indicators, targets, and criteria are taken into account within both internal and external evaluation and review of the cooperation framework. And just to end my presentation, you have a separate Annex A to the guidance where you have links to different approaches and tools for mainstreaming, and then Annex B and C, where you can find more information and examples of the links between environment, climate change, and development priorities, examples of relevant indicators and intervention measures. I think this is all from the presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Henrietta, for that second half of the presentation. We're going to have just a little very quick Q&A before we go into the breakout rooms where you can hear from colleagues, and we're going to get into more detail. But just a couple of quick quiz questions using the Slido poll just to see some of the key points from Henrietta's presentation. So if you do have questions, you can queue them up in the chat space here while we're going through the knowledge, the little knowledge check that we have. First question, it's a true or false question. The non-environmental development outcomes and outputs do not need to be aligned with the country's environment and climate change priorities and commitments. Of course, I think most people are seeing that this, in fact, is a false statement, of course, and that was one of the points that Henrietta had just made moments ago in her presentation. Another aspect I think that is important from the slides that we just saw were that this question here, in the process of mainstreaming environment and climate change in agencies, programs, and projects, what should be the very first step? Should it be a full-blown sort of assessment of the impacts, or should there be a screening level type analysis before getting into the details? What are people's thoughts on this? And yes, I think for the most part, respondents were recognizing that yes, it probably makes sense before getting into too detailed analysis is to do a screening level assessment to sort of identify which ones to spend more detailed time on and detailed analysis. So thanks for the quick knowledge questions. And now we just want to quickly open up the floor here before we depart into the breakout rooms and have a little quick break in and of itself. We look at the chat space, and you can also raise your hand as well if you have a question for Henrietta on the second part of her slides. While you're queuing up questions, I did have one question for you, Henrietta. I think that in cooperation framework documents, for the most part, all at least include one outcome, an output related to addressing environment and climate change. All sort of include at least one specifically. Some people would argue that this should be sufficient in a cooperation framework, and there's no need to address this in other non-environmental parts of the framework. What would you like to sort of emphasize in that regard?
Yeah, you are right. All of them have, I would say, very well formulated environmental and described environmental outcomes and outputs. I think this is not sufficient because I'm not sure in those. I'm not sure in this output you can address or focusing during the design only on this on environment and climate change within this output actually limits you in broadening your perspective on links with other development areas. If you don't cross-reference non-environmental outcomes and outputs with environment and climate change objectives, you are many times also using opportunities of how to contribute to improved environment and climate change within implementation of your non-environmental outputs. For example, just your priority is to help country in terms of good governance to improve their or to introduce the public financial reform. Maybe it would be a pity if you didn't try to at least raise awareness on green financing or green procurement or sustainable procurement, which would be also not a very costly addition. By addressing environment and climate change within the non-environmental sector actually could bring also more financial resources to address environment and climate change, because very often those other development results have higher allocation and also it is not about that environment and climate change would get more money, but also vice versa. By improving environment and climate change, you could improve achievement of your other non-environmental results.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, it's obvious that the environment and climate change is ubiquitous across the cooperation framework, so it makes sense to look at it across many facets for sure. Well, if there are other questions, we do have breakout rooms coming up where we will be exploring more of these topics, so you'll have a chance to bring up questions in coming up here shortly. We do want to move right now to our breakout room. So the second half of the webinar is going to be in two smaller groups, in fact, where you get to choose between two rooms, and you'll get a chance to hear from your colleagues, your peers from across the region in terms of their experiences in a couple of different areas. So we have two rooms. We've got two breakout rooms that we're going to open up here right away. The first room, room number 1, is about tools. It's going to focus on tools and approaches for doing multidimensional risk analysis, for doing those types of linkages matrices that Henrietta had presented. And that's part of the whole, in the CCA and in the cooperation framework design process. Those are very useful tools, and we're going to explore those in a bit more detail in the context of other facets of mainstreaming as well. So room number 1 is going to be that, and we're going to have a feature presentation from our colleagues in the RCO in Uzbekistan. and we'll have a chance to have an open sort of mic for people in that room to talk about those types of tools and approaches, your experiences, your challenges, enabling factors that have helped you with those types of tools and lessons learned. In room number 2, Livia will be facilitating room number 2. I'll be in room number 1. In room number 2, that room will focus on the results framework, approaches and tools that help with the mainstreaming and the results framework, and also in the identification and tracking of indicators. And that's relevant for the design process, implementation, and also monitoring and evaluation. Livia will feature some examples from Kazakhstan and also from Georgia, and there'll be a chance for colleagues in the room to elaborate and also to share their experiences, as well as a brief exercise that Livia will walk through. All right, so those are the 2 rooms. After about 30 minutes, we're going to come back to the main room, and we're going to have a bit of a plenary synthesis so you can hear what other colleagues said. See you all soon.
Well, welcome back, everybody. With no end of technical difficulties in our breakout room number 1, we did manage to complete and hear an excellent set of examples from Uzbekistan, our colleagues Zarif and Bakadur, about the various mainstreaming entry points, including risk and stakeholder analysis and a lot of other various aspects. So it was a very rich discussion. We had some questions in the room also about elaborating too on the aspects of the circular economy. So we really did get into quite a bit of depth and breadth through the Uzbekistan example. Just a couple minutes here. Zarif, are you back in the room? And Zarif from Uzbekistan, I know you were about to sort of sum up with a few main messages from your example. If you, Bakadur, would want to just share those very briefly right now for the benefit of the people that were in room number 2.
Yeah, thank you, Darren. Yeah, just to sum up our presentation and discussions, I think the key takeaways from our presentations are the fact that the CCAs are, of course, need to be, and they have to be, evidence-based and data-driven, and that was our essential part of our common country analysis. We made use of all the available expertise that we had in the UN country team. We made sure that the right people from relevant agencies are part of the interagency team that would be writing the common country analysis. We also, this was actually one of the questions from the audience. There was a question, when and what types of analysis did we use in our CCA? And we mentioned that the fact that although the CCA was written back in 2019, the first generation of new CCAs was back in 2019, we made 2 updates since then, and we updated on our analysis with new data in analysis that kind of emerged throughout these past 2 years in 2020 and 2021. So it's a living document. The next point was that, of course, any analysis needs to be kind of mapped through vis-a-vis the national development plans. We did a critical analysis of gaps and bottlenecks that need to be kind of addressed in our programs. That was also a critical part of our analysis. And another important point was that multi-stakeholder analysis and consultations are crucial. They always bring some new perspectives, and they help validate the analysis that we include in our CCA. And it's also a critical part of a good common country analysis report.
Excellent. Zarif, thank you very much. And Bakadur also for all of the information you shared and excellent examples of mainstreaming in Uzbekistan, and colleagues also for the questions in the room. Livia, over to you for a brief, just sort of recap of room number 2 for the benefit of room number 1 folks, and then we'll move right into closing remarks so we can get people close to out of the room at the scheduled time.
Yes, thank you, Darren. So we had a very good discussion about, indicator design and how to think about designing indicators when it comes to mainstreaming. We ended up doing an exercise focusing on water and agricultural productivity and how these things link together both in a positive way, but also in a negative way. And I'm not going to elaborate more, but we had a really great participation and great colleagues that talked about this issue. So I would like to invite, if he's around, Azisko, who talked a lot about this issue and help us with the indicators from our group.
Hi, colleagues. Yes, we discussed it increased agriculture productivity and use of water resources, and identified that introduction of the new technologies, providing financial services, as well as preparing rural people who would lose their jobs, low skills jobs, with alternative opportunities, as well as changing the vocational and education system to allow them get new skills for industry or service sector, would manage these risks of the increased agriculture productivity. And also we, in terms of indicators, we also put a share of women who have access to finance and technologies, also mortality and morbidity rate, because the more air and soil is polluted by inefficient agricultural practices, the more health problems will will rise in rural areas. And also water use level and water abstraction level by sector would also show that environmental impact of the water uses can be measured, because if inefficient practices are continued, the more waste of the water will happen, and that will affect on the ratio of the available and to use it water in different sectors and in different rural areas. This is shortly, and we discuss it in details in each of them. Thank you. Over.
Thank you. Yes, so I think now, as I got Darren's point properly, we are moving towards the closing.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I'm just in a position to thank for all of you for joining us today, to work through us with in the working groups, and also the big thank you for Henrietta, who did all the slides, the guidance, and work us through all the slides using her knowledge about mainstreaming. And it was really nice working with you, and we will kind of provide you information if you have further questions or anything, how you stay in contact. Thank you. And over to Matt.
Thank you very much, Livia. So just to reiterate your message, a huge thank you to everyone who's participated today. Thank you to IISD, to Livia, to Leslie, to Darren for their facilitation. Thank you very much to Henrietta for providing the substance and introducing it to us, and all the aspects that she's played in this important process. Also, thank you to the IBC core team that have been behind the preparation of this and the work that's been done in the background. So just 2 more points. There'll be a recording and a summary report of this workshop that will be made available in the coming weeks, and we will distribute this to you. And the final point is there should be a certificate of participation, which we will email to everybody that's joined in today. Okay, then I will pass over to Sarah with no further ado, and I wish you all a pleasant working day.
Yes, thank you, Matt, and you said all basically. So again, to reiterate on behalf of the IBC, I would like to thank everyone for very active participation in today's training. And since the IBC was established almost 2 years ago, we've been working in 3 major work streams. And one of them is, in fact, the supporting RCOs and UNCTs in the environmental dimension of UNSDCFs and common country analysis. And since the new guidance for cooperation framework was developed in 2019, many UNCTs have finalized their new cycle of cooperation framework in the past 2 years. And some examples of good practices of mainstreaming environment and climate change into cooperation framework processes were integrated in the mainstreaming guidance. And today's training, we also heard these examples, especially from RCO and presented especially by RCO and UNDP Uzbekistan. We hope such experience sharing was useful for those UNCTs that are rolling out new UNSDCFs, and we encourage RCOs and UNCTs to use the mainstreaming guidance at the relevant stages of cooperation framework processes they are now currently on. And if there is a need to have a follow-up support on specific environment and climate change issues at the country level, or any of the stages of the programming cycle, IBC is available to support such a process. And such kind of request could be sent to us through regional DCO. So I would like to again thank colleagues from the IISD and also our main consultant, Henrietta Martinokova, for designing and delivering this training today. And I also would like to thank our colleagues from IBC, especially from the core team, for your hard work to organize this nice training today. So this is it from my side. And now we will have, I think if I understand correctly, we will have the feedback session, like to have the to ask you to give the feedback on the training, and this will help us. This is also very important for us because we will have another 2 trainings for other 2 subregions in Eastern Europe and also in Western Balkans. So the feedback from your side will be extremely useful for improving the next 2 trainings. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.